Now that we've dealt with invalid user input, we need to think about other ways that we can make our programs more robust and more flexible. And one thing is to limit the range that the users can input. So for our guessing game, we want them only to enter in numbers between 1 and 100. One way of doing this is with a while loop, with this OR condition in the middle of it. So in this example, we're considering a menu, and the user has to choose a menu option from 1 to 5. At the start, we initiate the variable menu choice to 0, and then our while loop now has two conditions, or two parts to the condition. We're saying if the menu choice is less than 1 or the menu choice is greater than 5, then we want to go through this loop here. Now because this is an OR, if either one of these conditions is true, the whole thing will be true and we'll go through that loop. That's why we've got this line at the top putting menu choice equal to 0. So the first time we get to this statement here, menu choice is less than 1, that's true, therefore this whole condition is true, and we will go through the loop. We'll ask the user to enter in a number. If they put less than 1 or greater than 5, we'll say it's not a valid choice. Then we go back up to the top, and depending on what they typed in, this will be either true or false. If it's false, it means we have a valid number, and we'll go down to this print statement. Otherwise, we'll go back through the loop and ask them to type in another number. It would be a good idea for you now to pause the video and try and copy this code into pythontutor.com and step through the code line by line just to see the order in which everything's being executed and how it works. Right, so here we have our code to test out, and what I've done is I've actually removed this first line that we had, which creates that menu choice variable, just to show you what happens if we try and run that without it. It's a really common error that people will make, and they'll go straight into this loop. So if we try and run that code, you'll see our error message is that the name menu choice is not defined. And a lot of people find this hard to understand because we've got menu choice there, we've got menu choice here, but what's actually happening is when we first get to this line, because you're not creating the variable, you're actually trying to compare it to something else, it cannot find that already in the memory, so it's going to crash your computer. So that's why we need to have this line of code in, then when we run it. So now if we run our program, we can test that it's working properly. So let's try a number that's out of range to start with. So if we try number 10, it says it's not a valid choice. Number 0, also not a valid choice. And if we press 5, for example, that is a valid choice, and it's gone through and it says that it's all worked. It's really important as you're doing this to test around the boundaries, as I just did. So we need to make sure that we've got the correct less than versus less than or equal to, and greater than versus greater than or equal to. In this case, the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all valid, but 0 and 6 would not be. So those are our boundary choices, 0 and 1, and 5 and 6. So if I test at 0, not a valid choice, I test at 6, not a valid choice, test 1, that's correct, and I'll run it one more time, and test it at 5, and that's working perfectly. So we've tested around the boundaries, we've tested some expected values. Now what happens if we test something that we don't want them to type in, like a letter? This is going to crash our program, of course, but of course we now know that we can use a try except to prevent that from happening. We just have to think about how we're going to integrate our try except into our input validation loop that we've got here. Before we move on to that though, make sure you understand how this is all working. Try it out for yourself, change around some of the details, try some different numbers, complete lots of testing, and then if you want to, have a go at trying to incorporate that try except before I go through it in the next part of the video. So now we're going to have a look at combining both the try except and the input validation using a loop in terms of the range into one big block of code. Now if you're talking about our assessments and the kinds of structures that we need to have to get to excellence level, this is what we'll be looking for. It creates a really robust program that can accept all inputs, and it's very flexible, and it will only allow them to type in valid numbers within a certain range. So we're basically just combining the concepts we had before. We initialize our variable, we start our while loop. Again, it's an infinite loop while true, so we're going to need to have a break command in there somewhere. Then we go straight into our try except, and here we're getting the menu choice, and then within that try except this time we're checking the range. If it's not valid, we need to print out the appropriate message. If it is, then we need to break out of this while loop that we've got here. So if this is not a valid choice up the top, we're going to go down to this value error section and print that it's not an integer. Then of course it would go back up to the top of this loop again and repeat until they type in that something that is appropriate. So this is going to check both that it is an integer and that it's within the appropriate range. As with most things in programming, there's lots of different possible solutions to the same problem, and this is only one way of structuring this particular solution. And depending on the context of the program you're working in, this may not be the best structure to use, but you can certainly use this as a base to start from. Copy this code into pythontutor.com, step through it, make sure you can understand what's happening at each point, and test it thoroughly to make sure that it is working with all different possible permutations. Pause the video now, and when you come back we'll have a look at integrating this into our guessing game. So as you might have expected, the challenge now for your guessing game is to take our input validation a step further, and now we're not just checking for text, we also want to validate the range that they're inputting. So this will require a loop, and it will be a loop within the loop that we already have, and that's something that we call a nested loop. So pause the video, go back and see if you can get that working. Use pythontutor.com to help you find and solve any problems you might have, and then come back and we'll have a look at one possible solution. So now we're adding quite a bit of complexity to our program in order to make sure that we can get the appropriate input from the user and that our program is going to be able to hold up under any type of user input. In my solution here, I've added a second loop, this while true loop, that's inside the loop we already had. This part of the loop here, or this second loop, will execute independently of the first one. So what I mean by that is we'll start this first loop, and then this loop will go until it's complete. Then we go down and complete this block of code, and then back up to this first loop again, and then complete this whole loop independently again, and back through once more. And that will continue until guess is equal to the target. So this second loop I've got is an infinite while true loop, and of course we've got this break statement in here. But if you look closely at the code, we'll only get to that break statement if, first of all, they can enter a number that can be converted to an integer, so it's valid input, and secondly, if it is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 99. So that means we'll ensure that they enter in a number that's from 0 to 99, including both of those end points. So then we'll get to the break point, which will jump us out of this second loop rather, and down to this line of code here. Again, this would be a good time to use Python Tutor if you're not quite sure how this is all going to work, to make sure you can test it and understand what's going on. Note that down here I've stated that we don't need the continue command anymore. That's because we're within this nested loop. So this one will repeat until it's all sorted, and then we move down from there. So we're not going to go through any additional code until this input has been validated, and then we can move on. Note that this line of code I've highlighted here is a comment in Python, which means we can put some extra information in, but it's not going to be executed when we run the program. And to define that, we just put this hash symbol at the start of a line, which will enable you to do that. And it's a good habit to get into to start adding comments to your code where necessary. As our program's now getting a little bit bigger and a little bit harder to follow on the screen here, I'm going to copy in a link to the Python Tutor code into the description of this video so that you can check your code against that and make sure that you've got it working appropriately.